first day at a billion-dollar company, and you show up looking like this?
First day at a billion-dollar company, and you show up looking like this. Daniel Grant's laughter cut through the office like a whip. Around him, nervous chuckles followed, the kind that came more from fear than amusement. At the center of it all stood Emily Parker, clutching a few trembling sheets of paper in her hands, her simple clothes already turned into the joke of the morning. It wasn't unusual. Daniel loved to intimidate new hires, to remind them on day one that this empire was his alone. Most bent under his voice, stammering apologies, shrinking into the shadows. But Emily didn't. She stood her ground, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on him with a calm that unsettled even those who laughed with him. No one in that office knew the truth. Emily wasn't just another poor newcomer. She carried a secret, one strong enough to bring down the man who prided himself on breaking others. And soon, the billionaire CEO who mocked her would be the one left in ruins. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching, and don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The open-floor office buzzed with the metallic hum of computers, the shuffle of polished shoes on marble, and the quiet whispers of assistants trying to keep pace with deadlines. High above Manhattan, sunlight spilled through the skyscraper's endless windows, reflecting against the mirrored walls of Grant Enterprises, one of the most feared companies in the city. Daniel Grant, the billionaire CEO, stood at the center of the room like a man born to command. His suit was tailored so sharply it looked capable of cutting glass. Every movement dripped with arrogance, his cufflinks flashing like medals of superiority, his laughter echoing louder than it should. Around him, employees stood with tight smiles, unsure whether to laugh with him or remain invisible. And then silence broke. His eyes locked on Emily Parker. She stood by the reception desk, clutching a folder to her chest. Her clothes were simple: wrinkled shirt, plain slacks, scuffed flats that seemed out of place among the sea of polished leather and designer heels. She looked out of rhythm with the glossy perfection surrounding her. And that was all Daniel needed. "First day at a billion-dollar company," he said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "And you show up looking like this?" Gasps and nervous chuckles followed. A few employees pressed their lips together to suppress laughter, while others pretended to focus on their screens, not daring to be caught without expression. Daniel, however, leaned forward, pointing at Emily with a smirk that stretched too wide. "Tell me, Miss Parker, did you mistake this for a charity? Or maybe you thought you were cleaning offices instead of working in one?" His words carried venom coated in charm, the kind that stung twice as hard because it made people laugh. Emily's throat tightened. She felt the heat of a dozen eyes piercing her, burning into her skin, measuring her worth. Her hand trembled slightly on the folder, but she didn't lower her gaze. Instead, she pressed her lips together, steadying her breath, forcing herself to hold his stare. The silence stretched, suffocating. Daniel's grin widened at her discomfort, feeding off it. "Go on," he urged, tilting his head. "Explain to me how you thought this outfit screamed professional. I'd love to hear it." Her chest rose with a slow inhale. The room waited for her collapse, for tears, for a stuttered apology. But instead, Emily's eyes, calm, unwavering, locked onto Daniel's with a quiet defiance that unsettled him more than any answer could have. Something flickered behind her gaze, something unspoken that made the laughter around her falter for a second. It was not submission. It was not shame. It was something else, something Daniel couldn't place. And as the tension strangled the air, Emily finally opened her mouth, her voice soft but steady. "Mr. Grant," she said, her tone even, "I came here to work. If my clothes are what concern you most today, maybe you're looking at the wrong priorities." A ripple of silence moved across the room. The smirks faded. For the first time, Daniel's laughter stalled, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He hadn't expected her to answer like that. Emily clutched her folder closer, her knuckles white, but her gaze never wavered. Around her, whispers began, hushed, cautious, like sparks catching dry wood. Daniel straightened, his smile returning, but thinner now, colder. "Is that so?" he murmured, voice low enough to chill the air. The game had only just begun. The office returned to its rhythm, but the energy had shifted. The laughter that once filled the air now echoed only faintly, replaced by a cautious tension. Some employees stole glances at Emily, as if seeing her differently. Not just the poor girl in plain clothes, but someone who had dared to speak against Daniel Grant, the untouchable billionaire CEO. Daniel, however, didn't let it go. His polished shoes clicked against the marble as he circled his empire like a predator, his gaze always finding Emily. Each time their eyes met, he smirked, as though waiting for her to break. He thrived on submission, and yet she hadn't given him what he wanted. That was unacceptable. Hours passed, the city roaring far below them. Emily kept her head down, taking notes, carefully observing meetings, silently absorbing the atmosphere of power games and whispered alliances. Her presence seemed almost invisible, but her stillness drew attention. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't intimidated. And that bothered Daniel more than he could admit. By noon, Daniel saw his opportunity. A weekly staff meeting. Executives gathered around the long glass table, screens glowing with charts, assistants ready to record every word. Emily slipped in quietly with her folder, taking a seat near the back. Daniel noticed, and he decided to make her a spectacle again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming with theatrical charm, "I'd like to introduce our new hire." His hand gestured toward Emily like a magician revealing a trick. Heads turned, some curious, some pitying. "Miss Parker here graced us with her presence this morning, and though she may not yet understand the standards we keep, I'm sure she'll learn quickly." A few chuckles broke the silence. Emily felt them like daggers but didn't flinch. She placed her folder neatly on the table, her fingers smoothing its edges as though organizing her composure. Daniel leaned on the table, eyes locked on her. "Tell us, Emily, what makes you believe you belong here?" The question hung in the air, sharp, loaded, designed to crush. Emily looked up slowly. Her heart raced, but her expression was unreadable, calm in a way that unnerved even the executives watching. "I don't believe I need to prove that to you," she said softly. A silence so heavy it pressed on everyone's chest. Some shifted in their seats. One assistant nearly dropped her pen. Daniel's jaw tightened, though his smile didn't fade. Instead, he chuckled, low, controlled, masking the irritation bubbling beneath. "Confidence," he said, clapping his hands once as if to applaud her boldness. "Dangerous when it's misplaced, but—" His voice sharpened. "We'll see how long it lasts." Emily didn't reply. She simply lowered her gaze back to her notes, as though Daniel's challenge didn't deserve her energy. That silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. Around the table, the executives exchanged wary looks. Whispers spread like smoke. Who was she? Why wasn't she afraid? Daniel straightened, his smile thinner than before. "Let's move on," he said coldly. But deep inside, the question gnawed at him. Who exactly was Emily Parker? The afternoon sun slanted through the skyscraper windows, casting long golden streaks across the office floor. The city outside roared with sirens and honking taxis, but inside Grant Enterprises, the silence carried a heavier weight, the kind born of unspoken curiosity and restrained fear. Emily moved quietly through the rows of desks, reviewing documents, typing notes, blending in just enough to appear ordinary. Yet her stillness, her refusal to react to Daniel's sharp jabs, only sharpened the intrigue around her. Whispers followed her footsteps, but no one dared ask her directly. Daniel noticed. He always noticed. Power wasn't just in numbers or contracts. It was in controlling the narrative. And right now, Emily's silence was a story he hadn't authored. That infuriated him. Late in the day, he saw his chance. He summoned his top managers into the executive lounge. An intimidating space lined with leather chairs, glass shelves stacked with awards, and a view of Manhattan that reminded everyone of their smallness compared to him. Emily was ordered to attend as well, seated at the far corner like an afterthought. Daniel leaned against the table, sipping his espresso with deliberate ease. "So," he began, his voice dripping with amusement, "our new recruit thinks she doesn't need to explain why she belongs here." He looked around at his managers, smirking. "What do you all think? Should we test that confidence?" A few nervous laughs. No one dared to openly disagree. Daniel's eyes slid back to Emily. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice slicing through the air. "Why don't you tell us how you plan to contribute to a billion-dollar company? Please, enlighten us." Emily's fingers tapped lightly on the folder in her lap, a slow, steady rhythm. She looked up at him, her expression calm, her voice measured. "I plan to observe, to listen, to understand how this company really works." Her words hung in the air, deceptively simple, but they unsettled Daniel. Observe, listen, understand. It felt less like a promise of effort and more like a warning. The managers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension thickening. Daniel chuckled, though his jaw twitched. "Observe? You mean take notes while the rest of us actually build the empire?" Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes unwavering. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the one who observes sees more than the one who speaks." The room froze. Daniel's hand tightened around his cup. A few managers exchanged glances, their expressions betraying the thought they dared not voice. She wasn't intimidated. She was watching. Daniel straightened abruptly, setting the espresso down with a sharp clink. His smile was there, but colder now, stretched thin across his face. "Interesting philosophy," he said. "Let's hope it keeps you employed longer than a week." Emily lowered her gaze back to her folder, unbothered. Her silence was no longer submission, it was strategy. And though no one spoke it aloud, the balance in the room had shifted. Daniel felt it, and for the first time in years, he didn't like where it was heading. The next morning, the office carried a strange electricity. Rumors had spread overnight like wildfire, weaving through the cubicles and echoing in hushed tones over coffee machines. Emily Parker, the plain, soft-spoken newcomer, had looked Daniel Grant in the eye and pushed back. No one had ever dared to do that, not without consequences. Daniel felt it too. He entered the office earlier than usual, his stride sharper, his smile fixed like a blade. Power had always been his weapon, and humiliation his favorite tool. But Emily had refused to play her role as prey. That left him only one choice: crush her publicly beyond repair. By mid-morning, he made his move. Our company-wide meeting gathered hundreds into the main conference hall, a glass chamber with city views that seemed to pierce the clouds. Executives, assistants, interns, they all filled the rows, the chatter bouncing nervously off the walls. At the center, Daniel took the stage with a commanding presence, his suit glowing under the spotlights. Emily sat quietly in the second row, her folder balanced on her knees, her face unreadable. "Before we begin," Daniel announced, his voice booming with theatrical weight, "I'd like to start with something enlightening." His eyes flicked toward Emily, and the crowd followed. A ripple of curiosity ran through the room. Daniel smirked. "Miss Parker, stand up." A murmur. Emily rose slowly, calm, her shoulders squared, though her pulse raced. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel continued, pacing across the stage, "this is our newest recruit. As you can see, she believes presentation doesn't matter in a billion-dollar company." Laughter erupted, uneasy but obedient. Daniel's smirk deepened. "So tell us, Emily, how exactly do you expect to represent this empire dressed as if you wandered in from the subway?" Gasps, a few chuckles, but this time the laughter wasn't as strong. Something in the room had shifted. Emily let the silence hang. She felt the heat of dozens of eyes pressing against her skin, waiting for her to crumble. Instead, she drew in a steady breath and lifted her chin. "Respect," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the hall, "isn't stitched into a suit. It's earned through actions, through how you treat the people around you." The room went still. Whispers swirled like restless wind. Some employees lowered their eyes, uncomfortable. Others watched with wide, stunned expressions. Daniel froze for the briefest second, his smile faltering before snapping back into place. "Charming words," he said tightly, "but words don't build empires." Emily's gaze didn't flinch. Neither does arrogance. A collective gasp cut through the room. A manager coughed into his hand, hiding a smirk. An assistant's pen slipped and clattered to the floor. The atmosphere thickened, no longer tilting fully in Daniel's favor. He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow. "We'll see how long you last here, Miss Parker," he muttered, his voice carrying an edge sharper than before. Emily sat back down, calm, her folder steady on her lap. Around her, whispers spread like cracks through glass. For the first time in years, Daniel Grant's authority looked less like power and more like fear disguised as control, and the employees had noticed. The atmosphere inside Grant Enterprises no longer flowed with the same blind obedience. Something invisible had cracked. Whispers lingered longer in the hallways, glances darted quicker between desks, and people who once laughed at Daniel's cruel jokes now hesitated before forcing a smile. Emily noticed it all. She sat at her desk, pen gliding over her notebook with quiet precision. To anyone passing by, it looked like she was jotting down routine notes, but her handwriting carried more weight. Timestamps, words Daniel had used, faces of those who laughed, the subtle shifts in tone when fear collided with discomfort. Every page was a record, every line a piece of evidence. Her calm unnerved people. In the elevator, conversations hushed when she stepped in. At lunch, co-workers sat near her but rarely spoke, as if sensing something more beneath her plain exterior. She didn't force connection. She simply watched, her silence sharper than interrogation. That afternoon, Daniel stormed through the office like a storm contained in an Armani suit. He stopped at Emily's desk, towering over her. "What are you scribbling all day?" he demanded, his voice low enough to sting. "Plans for a fashion upgrade?" A few heads lifted from their screens, waiting. Emily looked up at him, her face unreadable. "Notes," she replied softly. Daniel leaned closer, smirking. "Notes about what?" Her hand slid across the notebook, closing it carefully. "About everything worth remembering," she said. A flicker of something, annoyance, curiosity, unease, crossed his face. He chuckled, masking it. "You'll learn soon enough, Miss Parker. Around here, the only thing worth remembering is that I built this company. Every paycheck, every light in this building, every one of you, exists because of me." Emily didn't respond. Her silence hung heavy, reflecting his words back at him like a mirror. He straightened, forcing a smile for the onlookers before striding away. Later, as the office dimmed and most employees left, Emily stayed behind. The skyline outside blazed with neon, the city alive with chaos, but inside she remained still. She flipped open her notebook again, reviewing her pages. Names, quotes, dates, patterns. A map of Daniel's arrogance laid bare in ink. She paused, her pen hovering. Then, in neat letters, she wrote a single sentence across the bottom of the page. "Power collapses when exposed." Her eyes lingered on the words. She closed the notebook, slipped it into her bag, and stood. For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. She wasn't just surviving in this company, she was preparing for something much bigger. The boardroom of Grant Enterprises was a cathedral of power. Polished mahogany table, walls lined with towering shelves of awards, and a panoramic view of Manhattan stretching endlessly beneath the glass. Here, decisions worth billions were made. Here, Daniel Grant reigned supreme. That morning, the room filled with executives in sharp suits, assistants shuffling papers, and members of the board seated at the far end, their expressions carved in stone. Everyone stood when Daniel entered, his presence commanding as always. He walked to the head of the table, his confidence unshaken on the surface. But inside, something gnawed at him. And then, Emily walked in. She moved with the same quiet composure as always, carrying her simple folder, her modest clothes stark against the sharp contrast of luxury. She took a seat at the far side of the room near the assistants. Her presence was small, yet impossible to ignore. Daniel smirked. This was his stage, his chance to reassert dominance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as steel, "today we review quarterly numbers, but before that," his eyes flicked toward Emily, "we have the pleasure of hosting our newest team member." A murmur spread across the table. The board's eyes shifted toward her, some curious, some disapproving. Daniel leaned forward, resting both hands on the polished wood. "Miss Parker, perhaps you'd like to share your insight with the board. After all, you've been observing." His tone was mocking, calculated to draw laughter. A few chuckles surfaced, but softer this time, restrained. Emily lifted her eyes slowly, her voice calm. "Observation reveals truths numbers can't." The room stilled. Even the board members exchanged subtle looks. Daniel's smile froze, then sharpened. "Enlighten us, then. What truths have you discovered in your grand 2 days here?" Emily opened her folder, pages of notes organized and meticulous. She didn't read from them, she didn't need to. She looked straight at him. That arrogance blinds leaders. That fear can silence a room faster than vision. And that respect is not owed, it is earned. Gasps rippled across the table. One board member raised an eyebrow, another leaned forward, intrigued. Daniel's face tightened, his jaw clenching as a laugh forced its way through his teeth. "Impressive speech," he said, voice sharp as glass. "But let me remind everyone, this company exists because of my decisions, my risks, my sacrifices. Without me, none of you would be sitting here, least of all her." His hand cut through the air, pointing at Emily like a gavel slamming down. The room fell into uneasy silence. Emily didn't flinch. She closed her folder slowly, her hands steady. Her eyes never left him, and for the first time Daniel noticed something unsettling. The board wasn't laughing. They were watching her, measuring her words, listening. The power in the room had shifted, and it wasn't in his favor. The meeting continued, but the air no longer belonged fully to Daniel. His voice carried numbers, projections, and strategies, yet the attention in the room drifted. Eyes lingered on Emily, seated quietly with her folder resting on her lap. She didn't interrupt, didn't seek the spotlight, yet she held it all the same. Daniel felt it. He pushed harder, his words louder, his smile tighter, forcing energy into a performance that suddenly felt desperate. For the first time, his empire felt fragile, as though a single wrong word could topple the illusion of absolute control. When the presentation ended, silence stretched. The board members exchanged glances, speaking with raised brows and subtle nods more than with words. Finally, Richard Halloway, one of the oldest and most respected directors, leaned forward. His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that carried weight without volume. "Daniel," he said, "your results are impressive as always, but leadership isn't only about numbers." Daniel's smile froze. "With all due respect, Richard, numbers are leadership. Everything else is just sentiment." Richard's gaze didn't waver. He shifted slowly toward Emily. "Sometimes sentiment reveals more than figures ever will." The room stiffened. Every executive turned toward her. Daniel followed Richard's stare, his pulse quickening. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge. Richard folded his hands. "That perhaps it's time we looked beyond the gloss and examined the substance. Miss Parker, after all, wasn't brought here by accident." A stunned silence. Gasps echoed softly. Executives glanced at each other in disbelief. Emily sat motionless, her expression steady, though her fingers pressed tighter against the folder. Daniel's composure cracked. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "What do you mean she wasn't brought here by accident?" Richard didn't answer immediately. His eyes, calm and knowing, rested on Daniel with the patience of a man who had already decided what storm to unleash. Finally, he spoke. "You'll understand soon enough." The room rippled with murmurs, like a tide pulling back before a wave crashes. Daniel's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing on Emily. She didn't move. She didn't speak. But for the first time, the weight of silence didn't fall on her. It fell on him. And in that moment, Daniel realized the one truth he hated most. Emily Parker wasn't just a girl in plain clothes. She was something else entirely. The tension in the boardroom was a living thing now, thick, suffocating, crawling across every inch of polished wood and glass. Executives shifted in their seats, the hum of the city outside muffled by the weight of what Richard had implied. Emily Parker wasn't here by chance. Daniel's gaze locked on her, cold and razor-sharp. His smirk had vanished, replaced with something darker, a flicker of unease he fought to bury. He straightened his shoulders, reclaiming his arrogance like armor. "Miss Parker," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "perhaps you'd like to clarify for all of us why you're really here. Because last I checked, I signed the contracts in this company, and I don't recall inviting spies into my empire." A ripple of shock moved across the table. The word spies hung in the air, dangerous and accusing. Emily's hands rested calmly on her folder. She didn't rush. She didn't stammer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, each word chosen like a stone placed carefully into a foundation. "I'm not here to take your place, Mr. Grant. I'm here to measure it." The room gasped. Several executives leaned forward, stunned. A member of the board tilted her head, watching closely. Daniel's face hardened. "Measure," he echoed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Measure what, exactly?" Emily lifted her eyes to his, unflinching. "Your leadership, your character, your ability to guide this company without destroying the people beneath it." The silence that followed was heavier than any insult Daniel had ever thrown. Executives avoided his eyes. Some glanced at Emily with a spark of respect, others with fear. Daniel forced a laugh, brittle and sharp. "Character? Are we running a charity now? This company doesn't thrive on kindness. It thrives on strength." Emily's gaze didn't break. Strength without conscience is weakness in disguise. A shiver ran through the room. Even the board members, long accustomed to Daniel's dominance, sat straighter, their expressions unreadable. Daniel slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Enough of this nonsense. You are an employee, nothing more. Don't pretend your opinion carries weight here." But Emily didn't flinch. She slid her folder open, revealing the neat stack of pages inside. Notes, dates, transcripts of words Daniel had spoken in meetings, even moments when his cruelty had turned the office into a stage of fear. Her hand hovered above the papers, calm and deliberate. "You're right," she said softly. "I am an employee, but I was chosen for more than that. The board wanted the truth, and I've been writing it down from the moment I walked in." Gasps echoed. Daniel's face drained of color, then flushed with rage. His empire, his invulnerability, trembled in that instant. The room was no longer his. The air inside the boardroom was electric, charged with the weight of revelation. For years, Daniel Grant had been untouchable, a billionaire CEO who silenced dissent with a smirk and crushed doubt with numbers. But now, the silence wasn't his weapon. It was Emily's, and it was lethal. She stood slowly, her hand steady on the folder as every eye in the room followed her. Executives leaned forward. Assistants held their breath. Even the board members, so often stone-faced, couldn't hide their anticipation. Emily opened the folder and laid the first page flat on the table. "These," she said, her voice clear, "are transcripts of meetings where employees were mocked for their appearance, their families, even their accents. Words spoken by you, Mr. Grant, in this very room." Gasps. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. One lowered his head, recalling the sting of those words. She laid down another page. "Here are notes of financial decisions made not for the company's health, but for your pride. Contracts forced through to outshine competitors no matter the risk." Daniel's face twisted, his jaw tight. "This is absurd," he snapped. "Fabricated nonsense. She's a nobody with a notebook." But Emily didn't falter. She pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it on the table. "These aren't just my words, they're yours." A sharp intake of breath swept across the room. One of the board members leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at Daniel. The billionaire's mask cracked. His hands balled into fists, his voice rising. "You had no right." Emily cut him off, her tone slicing through the room. "I had every right, because the board placed me here. My role was never to shuffle papers. It was to see you, to measure if the man behind this empire still deserves to lead it." The silence that followed was deafening. The words landed like a verdict. Whispers erupted at the edges of the room. Executives stared at Daniel, not with fear, but with something new. Doubt. A few even turned toward Emily with something dangerously close to respect. Daniel's face burned red, his chest rising and falling with fury. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. For the first time, words abandoned him. Emily's eyes didn't leave him, calm, steady, merciless. "You mocked me for my clothes," she said, her voice unwavering. "But the real poverty here isn't in fabric. It's in dignity. And dignity, Mr. Grant, is the one thing money can't buy back." The board members shifted. One cleared his throat, another tapped a pen slowly against the table. Judgment was coming, and Daniel knew it. The empire he built with arrogance was trembling beneath the weight of a truth he couldn't silence. and the woman he had mocked as nothing was the one holding it all in her hands. The boardroom was no longer Daniel Grant's throne. It was his trial. Every breath he took echoed too loudly. Every twitch of his jaw betrayed the panic beneath his carefully crafted mask. The empire he had built on intimidation and vanity was cracking before his very eyes, and the weight of silence was no longer his weapon. It was Emily's. She stood firm, her plain clothes illuminated by the skyline's glow pouring through the glass walls. Around her, the executives who once feared Daniel now shifted uneasily in their chairs, eyes darting between him and her. The board members whispered among themselves, their pens scratching notes, their expressions unreadable. Finally, Richard Halloway broke the silence. "Mr. Grant," he said, his voice calm but heavy, "we asked Emily Parker to join this company for a reason. We wanted truth, unfiltered, unflattering if necessary. And today, we've received it." Daniel's voice burst, sharp and furious. "This is a setup, a witch hunt. I've sacrificed everything for this company, my vision, my blood, my life, and you stand here questioning me because of some girl in second-hand shoes." His voice cracked. The words rang too loud, bouncing off glass walls, collapsing into something pitiful instead of powerful. Emily didn't flinch. She opened her folder one last time and slid the final page onto the table. "It was never about shoes," she said softly. "It was about who you are when no one dares to stop you." A silence followed, deeper than any applause could have been. Executives looked down, ashamed. Some nodded faintly, as though admitting to themselves what they had known all along. The chairman of the board, a woman with a stern but steady gaze, finally spoke. "Mr. Grant, arrogance may build an empire, but it cannot sustain one. From this day forward, your authority will be reviewed. Until then, your decisions are suspended." The words fell like a sentence. Gasps spread across the room. Daniel's face drained of color, his lips trembling as though searching for a rebuttal. But none came. His empire was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of wealth could buy it back. Emily closed her folder, her hands calm, her eyes steady. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply gathered her things and turned to leave. But as she passed Daniel, she paused. Her voice, low enough for only him to hear, carried the final blow. "You mocked me to feel powerful. Now look around you. Who's laughing?" Daniel's eyes dropped. His once commanding presence shrunk to silence. As Emily stepped out into the open office, hundreds of employees turned toward her. Not with ridicule, not with doubt, but with something Daniel had never commanded, not even at the height of his reign: respect. And in that moment, the girl in simple clothes had become the most powerful person in the building. The skyscraper still stood tall over Manhattan, but inside Grant Enterprises, the balance of power had shifted forever. Daniel Grant, once the untouchable billionaire CEO, now sat in silence, his arrogance stripped away in front of those who once feared him. The same man who mocked others to feel bigger was now the smallest presence in the room. Emily didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't in humiliation, but in truth. She had walked in on her first day with trembling hands and simple clothes, and she had walked out with something no suit, no empire, no wealth could ever buy: respect. And as she stepped into the lobby, whispers followed her, not of ridicule, but of admiration. She had shown them all that real strength isn't measured in money or titles, but in dignity, forgiveness, courage, and the quiet resilience to stand when someone tries to break you. That is the kind of power that endures. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.